museum educator at the New Mexico State History Museum, but many years ago I was the museum director up at the Rough Rider Museum, the City of Las Vegas and Rough Rider Museum in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And a lot of people probably don't know the connection between New Mexico and the Rough Riders, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and who were the Rough Riders in general. A lot of what people know about Rough Riders, they know from the movies. There were certainly lots of movies about the heroics of Theodore Roosevelt and his band of men in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. And a lot of people don't really know about the backstory about why we were even in Cuba in the first place. The 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, which is the official name of the Rough Riders, was an exceptional military unit that was created under exceptional means. Roosevelt was among people who were hankering after the Spanish-run islands off the coast of the United States, and after the Maine, remember the Maine, maybe from 4th grade, you've heard that saying. It was a U.S. battleship that had been tooling around in Havana Harbor, and it blew up. And it was this incident, which was written about with some really incendiary language in the American press, that a lot of Americans were like, well, we have to go in there and help these poor people in the islands win their independence from Spain. Of course, they are also people who are looking back at this. This was really our first foreign intervention, and outside of the Barbary pirates early on, and there was a lot to be gained from gaining land and control of Cuba and Puerto Rico ultimately, which is still very much part of what's in our news today. Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this time, and he had sort of been kicked upstairs to get out of the way of the party machine, and he did something that it's like unheard of today. You would never hear of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy resigning his post and joining the volunteers in the Army in a different part of the service. But that's exactly what happened. Roosevelt, going back to his own story, he had been out west, and before he was serving in government and so on, he worked on a ranch in North Dakota. He had a very romantic notion of all of the people who lived out west, all of the cowboys, and he basically said, well, we need to raise a cavalry unit. The guys out west already know how to ride, and they already know how to shoot, and they will send the troop trains out there. They would send the troop trains out through Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma, essentially today, and New Mexico and Arizona territories. So all of the relatively new American territories where there's a lot of these guys who already knew how to ride and shoot. Interestingly, though, once Roosevelt took charge of this unit with Colonel Leonard Wood, who was in fact the commanding officer, his Ivy League ties sort of gave this whole romantic notion about all these people, this is going to be a great adventure, and all of these Ivy League polo players from Yale and Harvard, the Glee Club, they all decided to, they were old money, and they joined up as well. Needless to say, it was a pretty motley crew with all of the Western guys, and these Ivy League guys who were put in charge of them didn't really speak the same language. They went down once they joined up, they were taken down to San Antonio to train, however briefly, before they would be taken down to the Caribbean. And it was during this time that the press sort of gave them the moniker the Rough Riders, because they were really rough around the edges. There was not a lot of time that they were training. There were a lot of the cowboys from New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma Territory, who didn't exactly wear their uniforms the same way that everybody else did. They wore their hats all a kilter. They also didn't have, there were a number of other cavalry units that were being recruited that went down to San Antonio to train, but ultimately they were not deployed because there was a lack of supplies. Roosevelt, because he could, ordered uniforms custom made from Brooks Brothers for all of his men, both the cowboys and the Yaleys. And so, needless to say, it's like they all wore it a little bit differently. And the irony of them being a cavalry unit, which is a military unit that fought with horses, is that when the troop ships came to take them down, there were not enough ships to take them to Cuba. Roosevelt commandeered a couple of ships for his men to get on, and the horses did not make it. And it's an interesting story. I didn't know about this. Colonel Leonard Wood, who is in fact the head of the unit, and there's a fort named after him in Missouri today, and he actually became very important for other things. Where there were a lot of people who would later be dying of tropical illnesses and so on, he pioneered the use of quinine in the treatment of tropical diseases. And so he was quite important. He was a physician. He was quite important ultimately when they got down there. But I don't know whether it was Stephen Crane, who was a reporter at that time on the front, who wrote back and said that they're not really Roosevelt's Rough Riders, they're really Wood's Wary Walkers. I got a call when I was working at the Rough Rider Museum in Las Vegas. I used to get calls from people all over the place. You know, City Hall was not paying attention, but I got a call from Jeopardy, who wanted me to verify that story, and did I think it was a good question? And I said no. I said nobody knows the answer to that question. Or very, very few people would know about Wood's Wary Walkers. But they ended up having to sort of bushwhack their way through jungles and whatnot. But the original plan was, as they got down there, they arrived, and their first battle was at the Battle of Guasimas, which wasn't a battle that really determined a change of events in Cuba, but it got written up in the press. Again, Hearst's press was very instrumental in this war in helping and making sure that people knew about the heroics that were going on, exaggerated or not. And it was also because of that the role of the Rough Riders was in some ways really elevated in the public memory, and certainly after the war, it happened very, very quickly with the Battle of San Juan and the charge up San Juan Hill, which has been in the movies, have been written about in all kinds of paintings and so on. And one of the reasons for that is the legends, if you will, of all of these and the heroics of these fellows was written about. Roosevelt himself came back and wrote a serialized story about his Rough Riders, which was printed in Scribner's magazine, and soon thereafter it was printed as a book. You can still find them. One of the things that I think is really interesting today, you can find he not only has lots of stories that are written about in his book, but he also has muster out lists with lists of who served, where they came from, where they signed up, and if they were wounded, if they died of dysentery, if they came home. And one of the things that's really neat is that among the Rough Riders, of course I mentioned they're not all from New Mexico. There were quite a lot of them that were from New Mexico. The irony in New Mexico is that when they came here, Miguel Otero was our territorial governor at the time, and of course we were hankering for statehood. And there was a sense of, in Washington that what New Mexico was not, it was too many Spanish-speaking people and too native. And Otero wanted the Americans that served in the Rough Riders to be as American as possible. So a lot of the Hispanics who came to join were actually told, no, we're going to take this guy and this guy and this guy. Ironically, there were a number of Nuevo Mexicanos who did serve and were written about quite heroically. When they got to Cuba, all of a sudden Roosevelt and Wood realized that it was really helpful if you're fighting with the Cubans against the Spanish, having somebody who's bilingual would be a good thing. So there weren't as many of them, but they were much celebrated. What I wanted to share with you about why we're standing here in this particular place, in this area you can see there's quite a lot of veterans and from some different wars, but I wanted to show you, if you're looking for the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, there were other cavalry units that would go and fight in the Spanish-American War. But the first U.S., which is the official name of the Rough Riders, you'll see this insignia here on the stones that belong to them. And on the muster-out rolls that are printed, you can find them in the book, or actually I found on the Library of Congress has a wonderful site in the Hispanic reading room. Amazingly enough, they have a whole bunch of articles and lists of resources, both in Spanish and in English, that talk about not only how people were received from the American side, but also how the War of American Aggression was, as opposed to the Spanish-American War, was perceived in Puerto Rico and Cuba. So you have this insignia down here, like a badge that they would have worn, and you can see this is 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry in the Spanish-American War, and generally up here this tells you this is Troop E. And so this fellow was a Rough Rider, and I was able to look him up. He was from Madrid, this particular fellow. And I don't know if there's still descendants that came in Madrid at the time. It's not likely. There were probably not a lot of people living up there. It was probably at that time, it was even before, I believe, that there were lots of mining enterprises in that area. It was probably some small ranches. There are, I believe, there's one down here. This McDonald. Now, this guy was in the Spanish-American War, but he was not in the 1st U.S. Cavalry. He may have been in Cuba, but he was in Company F, and he was in the 2nd Illinois. So this is not a Rough Rider, but it's the same vintage. He did fight in the Spanish-American War. But I'd have to look up the muster-out rolls to find out whether he fought in Cuba or whether he fought later on in the Philippines, where some of them did. And so you might wonder, like, why are some of these Rough Riders, some of whom had been New Mexican and some of whom weren't, they were from Illinois, after the war, the largest contingent of Rough Riders, the largest group of men who fought in the Spanish-American War with Roosevelt and Wood, were from New Mexico. And after the war, quite a number of them, even if they were different units, came back to New Mexico to live. And so he may have been originally from Illinois, that's where he joined, but after the war he came probably with some of the men that he met on the battlefield and lived out the rest of his life in New Mexico, which is why he's buried here. So that's one of the things. There's about 4 of them in this section, and I just wanted to point out, if you were walking through last year when I was here on Memorial Day, I did find a couple of other cavalry members in different sections. So some of them would be buried with their families, as opposed to just in this section, which for a time served as the military section of the cemetery, as you can see. And it extends through World War I. But it's actually really interesting to be able to find the badges and to see if you can find their families on those lists. in 1899, the Rough Riders had a reunion. The largest city that had the railroad at this time was Las Vegas, New Mexico. And the troops came in and had an encampment on Lincoln Park in Las Vegas, New Mexico. A lot of people say they were all at the Castaneda. That's not true. They wanted to camp, doggone it, and sing their songs and have horses and everything, which they did. Lincoln Park is just a couple of blocks away from where the Castaneda now stands. But they didn't all stay there. They all came in. They definitely had a drink or two down at the Castaneda bar. But they had their encampment in 1899 at Lincoln Park, which is, there's some really wonderful pictures. The Las Vegas Daily Optic, which is one of the oldest continuously published newspapers in the territory, had their offices right there on Lincoln Park. And so there were lots of neat pictures that were documented this. Over the years, the Rough Riders would, just like many other military units anywhere, would get together and have reunions and, tell stories and so on. They would meet in different places, including in Oklahoma, including in Arizona. But they came back in 1949, those that were left, for their 50th annual reunion. And it was around this time that there had been started a Rough Riders rodeo. That's, I don't know if anybody's ever been to Las Vegas. I know some people told me they're headed up there for the Santa Fe Trail events this week. The rodeo grounds stood basically behind where the Walmart is today. And there's lots of stories. I know some people who lived up near there off of North 7th Street and told me about, there's lots of people who've seen cowboy and Rough Rider ghosts up behind the Walmart, which is kind of an intriguing story. But old Rough Riders were part of the Rough Rider reunion rodeos, and they, as part of the grand entry, they would ride in with their old uniforms and ride around as to open up the rodeo. And that's part of the reason why about a decade later there was a historian at New Mexico Highlands University, which was New Mexico Normal School, Dr. Lynn Perigo, who asked if some people would like to leave their uniforms and so on. So we have in Las Vegas, in the collections, which is a tiny little museum, they have some of the original Rough Rider Brooks Brother uniforms, which is kind of nifty. That was another thing that it always, people are like, yeah, that's all that old stuff. Local people, and people would come in from Sagamore Hill or the National Park Service, whatever, because they wanted to see them. Sadly, even before I got there, there had been a number of arms, Krag rifles, and so on that had been used, that had been donated, that were all name attributed to different Rough Riders that were stolen over the years, and there was no record about where those things went to. That said, it's still a pretty remarkable collection to learn more about that, and it's pretty a remarkable legacy when you think about it. Do you guys have any other questions?
Tell us the Cuba Libre story.
Oh, of course. I never was able to make this happen, but I always thought that I would like to have a Spanish-American War cocktail party, because when they landed, there were, whether it's true or not, the legend is that the Cubans were so happy to see the Americans arriving, and they landed and waded in to the port and were greeted with Cuban rum. And funny story, that soon before that, and it actually probably had a lot to do today, wars are fought, people talk about all the reasons, whether it's oil or other kinds of things. Back then, the sugar and sugar cane in Cuba was an important commodity. We had sugar beets in the Americas, up in the Dakotas and so on, but doggone it, we had just invented Coca-Cola. And we had also just invented ice cream at the World's Fair. And sugar was really, really an important commodity. And so the story is that you've got the Cuban rum, the American Coca-Cola, you put them together, you have, what's the name of the drink? It's a Cuba Libre. It's a free Cuba, which is ostensibly what the Rough Riders did. So that's the story behind that drink. So I'm like, if you could have a Spanish-American cocktail party, you have to have a Cuba Libre. The other thing that I think is really wonderful is that a Bloody Mary is made with what? And what else is in it?
Tomato juice.
Tomato juice, and what else?
Celery.
Tabasco sauce.
Tabasco, yes.
Okay, Tabasco sauce was a relatively new invention. It came from the William P. McIlhenny Company. The McIlhennys also were Rough Riders. So without Tabasco sauce, you don't have a Bloody Mary, which can also be said to date from this era. So you've got your Cuba Libres, you've got your Bloody Marys made with Rough Rider hot sauce, which they didn't have in Cuba. And I'm trying to remember if there was another drink. I feel like there was one other one, and I'm not
Dark and
thinking
stormy?
thinking of it at this time, but that's enough.
Sounds like a great cocktail party to me.
I think that sounds like a great historical cocktail
I can
party.
make the Bloody Marys.
There you go.
That's my favorite winter drink.
Did Teddy give a speech at the balcony of the Castaneda?
When he arrived after the train, he did give a speech to all the people, because a lot of people gathered around there. He did give a speech there, and there's definitely pictures of that as well. But there's pictures of him also in Lincoln Park, which is pretty interesting too. When in 1999, and I was working up there, I worked with some Rough Rider reenactors who were reenacting from Company M, if I'm not mistaken, from Arizona, and they came in. There wasn't a reenactment group here in New Mexico, so I got these guys who had rebuilt their cavalry saddles. A couple of them had, and we purchased one for the museum that was rebuilt from an original McClellan saddle, which is on display now up there in Las Vegas. But we had a reunion there, and the fellows who came in did not want to go to the Castaneda. They said, we're camping at the park, and I got them permits to camp at Lincoln Park, where the men that they had learned about so much about had actually been. So there's definitely lots more stories about some of these individuals, and you can follow some of the stories from what was written in Roosevelt's book. And like I said, the muster rolls, if you don't find that book, which was reprinted by University of Nebraska Press around the year of the centennial in 1999. I think for several years it was still out. I don't know if it's in print now, but like I said, at the Library of Congress had all of the muster out rolls online. You can just go through them all and find out who joined from New Mexico, as well as from Indian Territory and Arizona Territory.
There was a hotel just next to the Alamo. I can't remember the name of it. They used to have reunions.
The Minger. It's the Minger Hotel.
Which?
The Minger Hotel, and the bars where he got a lot of the Rough
Well,
Riders.
it's interesting. If you
That's what
look
they
online
say.
at the Menger Hotel, I will just say this. The Texans claim the Rough Riders, that they were recruited there. They were training out on the fields in San Antonio and came into the Menger Hotel and got dropped there. But that is not where they were recruited.
Right.
The Texans will tell you otherwise. If you look at the Menger
That's true.
Hotel's website, there's a whole big thing, and it's not true.
It's in our Texas. It's in our Texas history books.
I'm sure it is. There were very, very, very few Texans, in fact, who served as part of the 1st U.S. Cavalry. And if you look at the rosters, they sent the troop trains out through the Western Territories. Yeah.
Thank you, Melanie.
Melanie.
Thank you.